what I want you guys to do is have a seat, and we're going to talk for a little while about the origins of the Fut'Ga techniques, what Tsoi Lei Ho is, how Kung Fu San Soo got here, how it was Tsoi Lei Ho Fut, how the Fut'Ga techniques came to be, and so forth. Because there's a lot of confusion, I think, about Tsoi Lei Ho, Fut'Ga, Ga, the Numpai techniques, the Asu techniques, Ga, basic 45, whatever. There's a basic 72. There are different sets of techniques that people have that, a lot of confusion, especially on the Tsoi Lei Ho, the Fut'Ga, and that kind of stuff. People have them categorized all kinds of different ways. But really, where all my information comes from is Carl Lorenzen. He and Jimmy were not just student and teacher relationship, they were best friends. They were, best friends. And they spent a lot of time together. They would sit and have coffee with their wives for hours upon end and just talk about different things. Carl spent from 1976 to 1984 in his garage with private lessons with Jimmy. They talked, he asked him questions. He wanted to know where all this stuff came from, how to do it, why it works the way it does, how does this system work as a whole, not just how to do a technique, but how does this technique relate to the form, how does this form relate to weapons, how does it all connect, and what is the system as a whole. And that would be really what Ga means. Ga means combinations or the grammar of the art. It means that all of these things are put together in such a way, in such an orderly manner, that it works as a system, as a language system. So you have a grammatic structure, just like the English language does. Okay? But when we go back, we have three families. If you go way back, probably 1 to 2,000 years ago. Nobody really knows. Jimmy didn't seem to know. Carl just said that he knew that it was way back in history, because back in China they didn't really have that kind of documentation of history. But there were three families, three literal families, lineages. There was the Tsoi family, the Li family, and the Ho family. And these three families had their own individual arts or Kung Fu systems that were their family systems back then. What they did is they joined together, they merged together. They took an area, a providential area. There's the village that Jimmy lived in. That was the area that they took. And they merged together, they merged their three systems together. So then it became Tsoi, Lei, and Ho. So they had to take their different Kung Fu systems and bring it in and try to blend it into one complete system. Who knows how long that took? And how many people and generations where they worked together to make this happen? But what they did is they got the village, they got the area, and then they built the monastery. So they built the monastery, and then as time went on, the Kung Fu system went into the monastery as well. And in that monastery is where things started to develop, where things started to come together. And again, nobody knows exactly how that happened, but what we do know is that the forms were inside that monastery. That's where those came from, the development of the forms. And those were Tsoi Lei Ho forms. The Fut'Ga techniques were the techniques that were based off of the form. We can talk about that in a minute. But the idea is you have the forms. The forms were the structure of how to move. And if you look at this little sign that we have here, this doesn't really show anything more for this purpose, is this X right here. In all of our forms, in every form that I've ever learned from Carl, there has been a center base to the form. There has been north, south, east, and west. And then you've got your quarters. Now, I'm looking at this from a horizontal plane. Okay? So I'm stepping forward, I'm stepping back, I'm stepping over, right? And I'm doing this pattern. Well, it's also a diamond shape, correct? Okay, everybody knows that you've got the quarters. One of these times we'll look at the diagram and we'll look at how the circles work with the triangles. Okay, because the whole concept of triangles comes from the forms for structure. And it moves into the Fut'Ga techniques. And then it moves into the combinations, the dakas, where you're angling off, how you're hitting everything. These triangles are very, very important for power and for structure. But it all starts right here. Okay, it starts with the form. The form is based that you are in the middle and you're going off to all of these angles horizontally and you're working within this area. Okay? Now that whole base, the whole concept of you being inside this circle, if you will, and you're working in all these different directions is very foundational to this art. If you see other forms where they're not utilizing this kind of a stepping pattern, I'm not sure where these forms came from. Because I have about 100 forms that they all use that. They step differently each time. And you're going sometimes using your left foot instead of your right foot, you're changing bases, you're doing all these things. But it's always very consistent to that pattern. Okay? Also, what I want to talk about form was the forms themselves. They were at one time 360 move forms. So we learned 19 move bases, and then Jimmy put a 6 move Zheng Hao, or introduction, which Carl told me that what Carl did is he asked Jimmy where he got those 6 moves from and how do they relate to the form, to moves 7 through 26, which is really the base of the form. And Jimmy told him, well, I took them from just a few forms earlier within the sets of the 360 move forms, which are other bases within a particular section of the art. Now, these Zheng Haos were just put on there to show you how you might present, how you might come in and introduce yourself. Then you start the form, which is move 7. The 360 move forms were taught 1 move a day in China. So on the first day of the Chinese year, they would do move 1. Then they would go out to the village and they would work all day. Then they'd come back at the end of the day and do move 1 and go home. This is what Jimmy told Carl. Then the day 2, they'd have 2 moves. Day 3, they'd have 3 moves. Day 4, they got the 4th move. At the end of the year, they were doing 360 moves in the morning, 360 moves. Then the new year comes along, the year of the dog changes to the year of the cat, the pig, the dog, whatever. It changed. Then they got move 1 of the next year form. The next year, the next year, the next year. Now, there are 17 bases of these 19 move forms within 1 year form. The 17 bases comes to, with transitions, about 360 moves. Okay? Now, another thing is Jimmy told Carl that he taught maybe 60 to 65% of what was in the books. Because Carl asked him all kinds of questions. He said, so Jimmy, he said, we have all these forms and all these techniques. And he says, and you have those 2 books. He says, how much of those books, the Kung Fu content, not the medicinal, healing, the holistic stuff, there was all that stuff too, because the monks were priests, and they were healers, and they used herbs, and they did all that stuff. All that stuff was in those books too, okay? It wasn't just the Kung Fu. But he asked Jimmy, what of the Kung Fu, what percentage do you think you taught? How much do you think you gave us over the period from, say, 1958, 59, all the way till 1984? Because that's when Carl stopped taking it with me. And he said about 65%. And we look at how many forms we had up to that point, and there might have been maybe 100 forms. Okay, and then when Jimmy came back, he maybe taught another 35 forms. So if there's 65% total at that point, now if you take that and then you add another 35% onto that, that comes to about 185 forms, something like that. And if you take 17 bases times 12 years, that's what it comes out to. So that's just one of those things where I thought was interesting, because they had a 12-year cycle. This is how they thought. Everything renewed itself, everything changed. It was part of their culture. So they had their Kung Fu set up that way. So there were probably 184 of these